Let me extend, first of all, my very warm welcome to everyone here today for this event on technology-enabled inclusive education, emerging practices from COVID-19 for learners with disabilities, that is being co-organized by the UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning and the UNESCO Institute for Information Technologies in Education. My name is Jennifer Pai, and I am a program specialist at IIEP, leading the work on disability inclusive education with a focus on capacity development. I will be moderating the event today. We had more than 900 registrations for this event, which highlights the significant interest in this issue, which is wonderful. A huge welcome to all of you. Before introducing today's presenters, let me start by addressing a few issues that will help you navigate the 90 minutes that we have together. Firstly, we have 2 sign language interpreters who will be supporting the event. They will be using International Sign. Please meet Susan Emerson and Krishna Sen. To improve accessibility, please note that you can pin their image to your personal screen. Please let us know if you're unable to see the interpreters on the Zoom screen. We're also using English live captioning, and the link to access the live captioning page will be provided in the chat. The live captions will be displayed on a separate document once you click on the provided link. Please also note that we are recording the event and will be posting it publicly later on the IIEP YouTube channel. We encourage everyone who is tuning in to please put their names and where they work in the chat function. I see that some of you have already started to do that, which is great. You can access the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and should you have any questions, please also place your questions in that same chat box. We will try to address your questions at the end of the event if time allows. Should you use social media, feel free to tweet about the event using the hashtag #PlanForInclusion with the handle IIEP-UNESCO, which we will also place in the chat. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Mrs. Natalia Amelina, Senior National Project Officer at the UNESCO Institute for Information Technologies in Education in Moscow, to say a few opening remarks. Natalia, please, the floor is yours.
Jennifer, thank you so much for this introduction. Dear speakers, dear participants, very good day to all of you, and greetings from UNESCO Institute for Information Technologies in Education, which is located in Moscow. It is a great pleasure to have all of our participants today at the webinar, where we'll discuss the potential of the open and distance learning tools for education of persons with disabilities. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the shortcomings, fragilities, and inequalities in education of students with disabilities within and across countries. According to the United Nations, around 1 billion persons with disabilities in the world are among the hardest hit by COVID-19. Around the world, many countries employed technology-based solutions to ensure continuity of education through alternative delivery modalities, including online and distance learning, with the aim of leaving no one behind. Some countries have developed tools and resources for learners with disabilities and their parents, such as enhancing accessibility features like simplified text, audio narration, sign language videos, and the provision of assistive technologies. And it remains vital to recognize the specific demands of learners with disabilities and further provide the tools and software that enable their full participation in distance learning. Through the COVID-19 caused education crisis, open and distance learning has proved to be among the most efficient and meaningful solutions to address dramatic learners losses and prevent major dropouts, including among students with disabilities. And let me inform you that recently, jointly with UNESCO IIEP, we have arranged a rapid assessment study in the countries of the African region, including Rwanda and Mauritius. Also, we have collected a number of best practices, case studies, and we are very glad to share it today with you, with all of you. And I would like to mention that a number of specialists and organizations have been very helpful in contributing and arrangement of this research study. And we are very glad to have their support, including the support of the National Commissions for UNESCO in Rwanda and Mauritius, UNESCO Nairobi office, and national consultants from these countries. Let me also say special words to UNESCO IIEP for their coordination and full support, full organizational support of this study. It was a great pleasure to work with colleagues. And let me wish good luck to this webinar. And this is a pleasure for us to be with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalia, for the introduction to today's event. So let me move on. For today's webinar program, we will have 3 presentations featuring findings from research from Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Mauritius. We will then proceed to a panel discussion looking at practical solutions to the challenges, barriers raised in the presentations, and how the recommendations from the studies can be implemented. Now, let's move on to the presentations. We are pleased to have a very diverse panel join us today from a wide range of different organizations. I am delighted to introduce the keynote speaker for today, Mr. Ken Chua. Mr. Chua is the founder and director of Disabilities, an inclusive design and technology agency with headquarters in Singapore that works with companies and organizations to build inclusive policies, products, services, environments, and campaigns that serve not only persons with disabilities, but as lived experience for all. Ken spends his time exploring sustainable and scalable ways to prove the value of disability towards mainstream society as contributors of societal value and not just beneficiaries. Mr. Chua, I'm handing the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And hi, everyone. Good day to you, wherever you are. Hope you're having a good day so far. Please do let me share some of the thoughts that I have with regards to education in the pandemic. So first of all, thank you to the event organizers, UNESCO, IIEP, and IITE, for giving me the opportunity to deliver this event's keynote. I'm honored to be in the presence of the many passionate and illuminating minds working towards building more inclusive educational ecosystems that are resilient even in times of a pandemic, of which you would hear more from in the presentations and panels to come from Mauritius, Rwanda, and Bangladesh. So as an inclusive designer and engineer by training, and social impact strategist and inclusive design technologist by profession, I run an inclusive innovation agency where my daily work revolves around consulting with organizations on building more inclusive products, services, environments, and policies that serve the needs of the various disability communities. But in the last 18 months of living amidst the pandemic, my work has revolved heavily around sniffing for gaps in support of disability communities with regards to COVID-related matters on safety, well-being, and access to essential services such as education. I live in Singapore, a tiny island state nation known for its high PISA rankings and high-tech infrastructure. So one might think that we all have it covered during this period. But just like all other nations, there too are gaps that are universal to all countries and cities, developed, developing, underdeveloped, or otherwise, when it comes to access planning for learners with disabilities. This is because planning in a time of crisis truly flashes out the inequitable biases and blind spots we as decision makers have in understanding the needs of learners with disabilities, which makes SDG 4 on quality education, and in this case, equitable education, a perennial challenge facing all of us globally. As the saying goes, diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. Similarly, whilst we may recognize the importance of accommodating diverse needs in education, it would be a missed opportunity if we don't work hard to address them. Now, in peacetime, we will look towards the universal design for learning, for inclusive learning best practices to achieve best learning and developmental outcomes. However, in the era of COVID-19, which some consider a war against an invisible enemy, the classroom grounds have literally shifted from school compound to living quarters. As such, referring to UDL alone may not suffice, as education is now much more closely intertwined and influenced by wider societal implications of health, safety, and even changing financial and psychosocial circumstances for parents and caregivers as home-based learning or even homeschooling becomes the new norm, with periodical stay-home notices in all national efforts to suppress COVID-19 infections on a local, regional, and national level. Oops, sorry, let me just switch slides. Yeah. So because of that, I believe that these urgent times require us to look at the larger ecosystem of education more holistically on a macro scale, which is why I look back to the origins of universal design for learning that is within the 7 principles of universal design, commonly used in architecture, product, and service design for some answers. And in true spirit of adaptability, which I believe to be a true hallmark of the global disability population, and that has been instilled in me by the disability communities that have embraced and taught me so much over the last 13 years, I'm inspired to ponder on some adaptations to the original principles of universal design that may help to provide some answers towards viewing education through a different lens in a time of a pandemic. In my personal adaptation of the original principles of universal design, I've repurposed some of them into guideposts, building back better for more inclusive education affordances in a COVID era, and I'll give you some examples. These are by no means definitive in my attempts to find answers, and will welcome healthy debate to further strengthen our approaches towards building more resilient educational futures. So you can have a read through and I'll go through them one by one. So if you were to look on the right and look at the guideposts, the first one is on equitable education in times of crisis. The quality of service delivery must eventually be maintained at least to peacetime levels as much as possible and accessible to learners of all types of disabilities. It is understandable that curriculum might need to be trimmed in the early stages of transition, due to the various forms of distance learning, so as not to compromise quality over quantity. In fact, it is what some nations like Malawi have done to cope with constraints such as lack of ICT skills in teachers and students, parents and caregivers in online distance learning approaches. It is a measured approach, as the last thing we want is overloading an already overwhelmed household with too many new instructions and methodologies of learning across multiple subjects and topics for the child with disability. However, we should not rest on our laurels and continuously seek better improvements for a more seamless and effective distance learning approach. And in fact, with self-paced online modular distance learning, it should no longer be seen as a replacement for traditional teaching methods, but rather as part of a blended learning strategy to help prepare our learners with disabilities to be independent and self-directed learners, which are important 21st century skills beyond COVID-19 as we move further ahead into the fourth industrial revolution, where digital skills are highly valued and necessary. This is also the view of the Ministry of Education in Singapore, and their views on the matter. As such, increased funding of digital tools and assistive technology can be seen as a long-term investment instead of a stopgap measure. This will help ensure greater access to educational material that can leverage on low-cost, technologically enabled accessibility features such as screen readers, automated captions, and low-effort and reduced cognitive input interfaces. On flexibility in teaching and ease of new use and learning environment, the range of methods and mediums, which include text, worksheets, radio programs, TV programs, videos, learning management softwares, these should all accommodate the wide range of abilities, circumstantial backgrounds, and bandwidths, which include radio, cellular, and Wi-Fi. This is already done somewhat in effect with IEP or Individualized Education Program in countries like Thailand and Indonesia. But there will also be limitations on offering IEPs to more students on a larger scale. A little bit more flexibility can go a long way in gathering resources that would offer a larger offering of educational services to students. And what helps with flexibility is modularity, which allows for smaller, more manageable tools for educators to learn and implement, as well as for learners to access and use. Now on the third one, on simple and intuitive tools for low to gentle learning curves. It is with ICT tools for online distance learning and home-based learning where there is a steeper learning curve, especially in areas which are new to technology and increased connectivity. Despite being a whole new dimension to grasp, ICT tools should be easy to understand, regardless of a user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or concentration levels, where these new methods should aim to minimize mental fatigue for learning how to use these new platforms and how to maximize comfort, comprehension, and confidence, both in teachers and learners, including their parents. If new tools require substantial onboarding support, try breaking it down into manageable bite-sized chunks or have vendors to aid with installation so that only ICT maintenance skills need learning. This is best done with a personal touch, such as with home visitations or even remote desktop access support. However, the most important point to note is not to plug and play foreign solutions wholesale. It will take some hard work to localize new tools to your context, but it is short-term pain for long-term gain. And if you can learn the technology well enough to explain it to learners with disabilities and include them in the implementation process, then you probably understand the technology very well by then. On the fourth one, on perceptible classroom material, it is about leveraging the perks of technology to account for the diversity of access pathways of the learning content. In the modern day, technology and the internet offer solutions to all learning access needs, with a large majority having free and open source versions. An example would be NVDA, a screen reader that is free and open source, which means it is constantly being improved by a global community of users, unlike a software like JAWS, which is only updated periodically and determined by its parent company. But technology aside, some access needs are still more human in nature, such as self-paced learning plans for students with intellectual disabilities or on the autism spectrum. To this end, self-paced modular learning programs work well, something that several special education schools in the Philippines are already doing. And lastly, on tolerance for crisis. In unintentional and adverse situations such as pandemics, we need to plan and be trained for more contingencies to avoid a complete drop-off in student engagement. This diverse and rigorous approach, which requires greater capacity building in preventative initiatives such as Teach the Teacher programs and other modalities, will greatly improve our resiliency in education. For example, in Singapore, even with home-based learning, schools remain partially open to host students whose households may include exposed frontliners, non-conducive environments for learning, and those with higher support needs, with many other appeals being considered on a case-by-case basis. As many of us would know, a complete drop-off in student engagement in special needs education does not just pause learning. it might also risk regression in developmental outcomes. So this should be avoided at all costs where possible. With that, I wrap up the adaptation of the original 7 principles of universal design, which of course should be in consultation with the 3 aspects of universal design for learning where applicable. In my concluding remarks, this is what I would have to say. In Building Back Better, I have a word of caution for schools and governments that in times of urgency to build back faster, don't forget to build back smarter and considerably if you want to come out of this version better than before. Reinventing yourselves also means taking lots of previously avoided hard work in consulting persons with disabilities and other underrepresented groups in more authentic ways than previously sufficed. There are very few chances in our lifetime that legacy systems and infrastructures are allowed the time and space to rebuild from scratch, an opportunity that only a crisis as large as this is able to provide. I hope you respond to this grand opportunity in good faith and spirits and not to react in haste. I'm looking forward to hear of the great examples of resiliency in education to build back better amidst COVID-19 through technology and otherwise. And I hope you're as excited as I am for these presentations and panels to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken, for these inspiring words. A great introduction to the theme today of Building Back Better, coming out of COVID-19. Let me straight away move on to introducing our next presenter, who will be presenting a research study. I'm happy to introduce the first speaker, Sergei Pankin. Mr. Pankin is advisor to the Director General of the International Research Institute for Advanced Systems in the Russian Federation. Mr. Pankin will be presenting on inclusive, open and distance learning solutions in Rwanda and Mauritius for students with disabilities served by inclusive, special schools and resource centers. Mr. Pankin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Colleagues, good afternoon. Let me introduce myself. I'm Sergei Pankin from Russia with love. I would like to sincerely thank you for the opportunity to take part in such an interesting project. Miss Jennifer, Miss Amelina, thank you for your clearly guiding our interaction. And Miss Andurantha and Mr. Matias, I was glad to interact with such respected specialists in the project. Thank you for all very much for your responsible and professional work. Please, slide number 1. Dear colleagues, today I'm honored to present you the analytical report on COVID-19 and inclusive open and distance learning solutions jointly produced by UNESCO Institute for Informational Technologies and Education and UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning. The rapid assessment was conducted with the expertise and support of a number of specialists and organizations, including the Ministries of Education of target countries, Rwanda and Mauritius, and the National Commission for UNESCO. The report is ultimately to contribute to the achievement of the goals of the global program supporting disability, including COVID-19 response and recovery at national level, funded by the United Nations Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Please, slide 2. In line with UNESCO's approach and the purpose of this study, Ordeal will be defined as learning that incorporates the following main features. Teachers learn separation by space and time or both, two-way communication and group communication network, the use of media and technology, and more personalized educational experience. Slide 3, please. In order to prepare a relevant analytical report, a 5-stage approach was used. During the first stage of the project, the interview protocol for rapid assessment of the development and implementation of inclusive ODL solutions in both countries was created. In the second stage, national consultants interviewed at least 25 educators in urban and rural areas and identified results and challenges of distance education of persons with disabilities during COVID-19. During the third stage, they received replies and the implemented literature review, although the development and analysis of the policy and strategies. During the fourth stage, main challenges, lessons learned, and prospects for development of ODL solutions for education of persons with disabilities were identified and recommendations for development were articulated. During the fifth stage, the analytical report was presented and discussed with educational stakeholders of Rwanda and Mauritius. Slide 4, please. Let me share with you some things from the Rwanda. Slide 5, please. Inclusive education grew faster in Rwanda in the last decade. However, the finds of the studies reveal the disability and gender digital divide still exists. At the same time, a human-based approach was identified during the analysis of the recent national education policy in regard to gender equality and ensuring the rights to education of students from vulnerable groups, including students with disabilities. Laws and policies supporting women and vulnerable populations in Rwanda demonstrate a profound desire to project, support, and empowering girls, women, and personnel with disabilities. Slide 6, please. Rapid assessment in Rwanda was carried out in total 25 inclusive and special schools and resources centers for students with disabilities, both in urban and rural areas. Educational institutions of the study included 397 boys and 266 girls. The respondents included 7 directions and 20 teachers, of whom 74% was men and 26 were women. Slide 7, please. Prior to the pandemic, out of 25 respondents with knowledge in basic ICT skills, 9% received initial training in continuing education. 7 respondents did not receive any training. 5 respondents are currently being trained, and 4 respondents completed the initial training themselves. Regarding special training in the use of ICT and assistive technologies in the training of students with disability, 15 respondents did not receive such training. 6 respondents did so before the pandemic, and 4 respondents did so during the pandemic. Slide 9, please. Slide 8, please, sorry. The respondents to the COVID-19 pandemic, many educational institutions in the country were unable to introduce ICT for distance learning because of lack of financial resources, infrastructure, and connectivity. Or only few provided information about specific assistive technologies available during the pandemic. Educators and students from the University of Rwanda received their hardware and software to use that you may find on the slide. All these technologies were provided before the pandemic and allowed to adjust the ODL process to the needs of the visually impaired students during the COVID-19 outbreak. The different interviewers revealed that the most resources provided by the schools were the TV and radio programs that helped students, teachers, and parents to continue education during the lockdown period. Some also brought the case of the e-learning platform by Rwanda Education Board, which even now continues to be the great source of learning and teaching materials. Slide 9, please. During the interviews, teachers indicated that they faced the following barriers that you may see in the left column of the slide. One of the main barriers is a lack of tools for remote education. At the same time, students with disability have been impacted not only through disruption to their learning, but also by the additional stress and isolation. One of the general challenges is not effective engagement in virtual learning due to lack of appropriate infrastructure at home. Slide 10, please. The following enabling factors that promote the use of ODL were identified within this study in Rwanda. The increase of government initiatives related to education of persons with disabilities, such as Smart Africa. All schools, centers, kept contact with students on the regular basis to ensure their well-being, continuing studies, and daily routine. Online education was more efficient when compared to other tools for remote learning, but it was possibly mainly for high-income level families. Sorry.
Mr. Punkin, can I just remind you, you have 2 minutes left. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Establishment of partnerships with NGOs support educational process involving parents where possible. Good level of motivation among teachers in the use of ODL solutions in COVID-19 educational environment. In spite of some good initiatives, students from poor family tend to be less able to access ODL programs. In addition, more educational providers have not received additional training and were not qualified to provide students with inclusive ODL education materials. Please, slide 11. Another target country of our needs assessment was Mauritius. Slide 12, please. Analysis of the national education policy in Mauritius has showed continuous efforts of the government to ensure the rights of education for students from vulnerable groups, including students with disabilities. A number of legislation acts together with the Constitution of Mauritius contains a non-discrimination provision. Slide 13, please. The 9 districts of Mauritius have respected in the data collections of this study. The most educational institutions of this study were concentrated in the rural area, while only 15% were located in the urban area. The majority of respondents have enough experience in working with students with disabilities. Most of them are women, 81%, while only 19 are men. The current study covers the primary, secondary, and vocational schools. Slide 14, please. Within the current study, the respondents informed us about the low level of training facilities in the field before the pandemic. 15 respondents admitted that they had not received any training on ICT before the pandemic. 10 respondents received training before the pandemic during initial training and as part of continuing education. And only 2 respondents actively used ICT before the pandemic. The collected data revealed that most of the respondents 83% did not receive any specific training on the use of ICT and high-tech assistive technologies, while the remaining 7% agreed to receive of such as training. Slide 15, please. During the spread of COVID-19 across the country, lessons for primary and secondary schools were broadcast of the special educational channel. However, they were not adapted to the needs of students with disabilities. The most relevant educational tools were video and e-book. Transition from a traditional to a new mode of learning was well received by 9 respondents. Thus, 17 of respondents was motivated to make effective use of Ordeal to educate students with disabilities. During the pandemic, the most widespread platform was WhatsApp Messenger. Slide 16, please. Jennifer, sorry, maybe 3 minutes, please. Slide 16. A brief analysis of perceived utility, usability, and attitudes toward ICT use among students showed a good level of motivation for application of new technologies. 66 of students appreciate the high degrees of perceived utility thanks to rapid achievement of objectives, improved quality of education, more control our learning, and only 16 rated as a medium and 90% rated it as low. Slide 17, please. The national expert identified the following main barriers to the effective use of Ordeal solutions for students with disability. Lack of knowledge about assistive device and their effective use in open and distance learning solutions. Lack of internet connection and or digital devices. Lack of sufficient digital skills and ICT competence, lack of time for professional development, lack of knowledge about the capabilities and potential of mobile applications in teaching and learning, like EdTech innovations, lack of time to interact with colleagues, lack of support from the supervisor management of the school for the use of Ordeal solutions. In addition to this, 33 of respondents reported that mental health has a major impact on the use of Ordeal. Slide 18, please. Summing up, the following challenges was identified regarding education of persons with disability during COVID-19. A lack of financial and technical resources in both countries. Insufficient leadership and management strategies from those responsible for education of persons with disability in both countries, especially in Rwanda. Existing equipment is usually outdated. Specific assistive technologies as rare and used in a limited number of centers. A lack of networking and exchange of good practice. A gap between rural and urban areas on providing accessible and quality education. insufficient training opportunities for teachers, especially in terms of ICT competence and high-tech assessive solutions. A lack of support for families in terms of arranging learning process from home due to low internet connection, absence of PCs, smartphones, and lack of technical pedagogical assistance. No sufficient modernization of educational policy, especially in the use of ICT in Ordeal solutions. Slide 9, please. Based on the employment studies and revised things, the following recommendations were developed. In order to narrow the digital divide, specific efforts needs to be provided, such as a promotion simple technologies, such as TV and radio-based learning, on the principles of inclusively and equality. New policies and regulations of promotion, accessible infrastructure, and remotely delivered connect, as well as ensuring technical and pedagogical support are required. The effort of to develop teachers' competence shall include training of instructions, support of educators and IT administration on accessibility issues, assistive technologies, and open solutions, and disseminating of best practice. The measure taken by National Education Office shall include flexible content, curriculum delivery methods and assessment, target instruction, student reflections, and feedback. Additional teacher time with students and parents in inclusive culture where studies act as resources for each other. It's important for regional government, IT and educational companies, schools, parents, general public, and scientific research institutes to work closely together through national and regional collaboration. Thank you very much for clearly guiding our interactions. Thank you very much. Jennifer?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much,
I'm sorry
Sergey.
for my long speech.
Yes, you did go a little bit over your allocated time. So I would like to remind all the panelists, please stick to your time window, because otherwise we'll not be able to stick to the 90 minutes.
I'm very sorry.
Thank you, Sergey. It was a very interesting presentation. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. We are going to move straight into the presentation by Mrs. Anuradha Gungadin. Mrs. Gungadin is a senior lecturer in open and distance learning in Mauritius at the Institute of Education. And she will be presenting a case study on COVID-19 technology-based education and disability in Mauritius. Mrs. Gungadin, please stick to your 10 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Warm greetings from Mauritius. It's indeed a pleasure, a privilege to be here to share with you. Before I start, my heartfelt appreciation to UNESCO, IITE, and IIET teams. I will be grateful to share with you the findings on the case study from Mauritius on emerging practices from COVID-19 for the learners with disabilities. Next slide, please. So you all will concur with me that we are all different, so we are unique, and no doubt education is strongest when it embraces equity, diversity, and inclusion. So a belief in the right to education is a belief to inclusion, equity, and diversity. Absorbing from these words, we can proudly say that, affirm that the government of Mauritius strongly supports this inclusive approach driven in education, and that reflects in our legislation and policy frameworks. Next slide, please. Just to state a few, next slide, please. So we have the Lois Largesse Act, Rehabilitation of the Disabled Act, the Trust Fund Disability Act, Training and Employment Act. Next slide, please. And also emphasis on a few acts in education, the 1957 Act, our constitution itself, the special needs inclusive education policy, the policy framework and strategy developed by the Ministry of Education, the our ratified signature within the UNCRDP, and also the most awaiting Disability Act, hopefully this year. Next slide, please. So moving on to the focus of our study, we need to understand the pre-COVID situations, the COVID situation, and how it impacted on the post-COVID learning environments for learners with disabilities. Next slide, please. So just a few words on technology and disability context. We have to acknowledge that the Ministry of Education here has provided digitalized learning environment in 10 schools, couple of NGOs within that Sankore project, where we have interactive whiteboards, laptops, and projectors, and aligning with the same force of inclusion for learners with disabilities. We have adapted computers for learners with visual impairment. And during the pandemic situation, we also witnessed how distance learning was dispensed through TV broadcasts, and also the use of social media was there. The Mauritius Institute of Education, our only teacher educational institution in Mauritius, we had access to all the textbook in the flip format available on the MIE portal. And also very important to note that there is still going on the adaptation, not translation, but adaptation of primary textbook into Braille for all learners with visual impairment. And this is going to escalate from primary to secondary schools. Next slide, please. So just an overview of the case study. The aim drives us to understand the relevance, effectiveness, efficiency of the use of Ordeal solution during the pandemic situation, and also to provide key recommendation for sustained Ordeal practices for learners with disabilities in post-COVID learning environments. And the major participants were the Ministry of Education, NGOs, and integrated units, MIE, DPI, DPO, Inclusive Education, and the United Nations. And here, online interviews followed by online questionnaires followed by online interviews were utilized. Next slide, please. So that brings us to in a nutshell, to understand the key findings of this case study in Mauritius. So collaborative and collective efforts within the government sector, NGO, teacher education was highly echoed. It highly echoed during this case study, and also consultation from bottom up within the policy dialogue to include everyone within the SEN sector. We should also remember our learners with disabilities. So how we are going to ensure the learning continuity in terms of access, communication, engagement of the learners, motivation, and also the confidence levels of the learners. And this brings us to the sharing of resources and expertise within different levels and across institutions. And we should also not forget our teaching community. So we have to prepare and continue preparing and empowering them for a sustained professional development to meet the specific needs of learners. Next slide, please. This brings us to the key recommendation in terms of the national ICT policy for SEN education, adapted curriculum for SEN learners, school partnership, parent training. We have witnessed that the role of parents have been crucial during the pandemic situation. In terms of the funds that should be targeted and equitable, in terms of the technological support, professional development of our teachers, we have to forge partnership and relationship among different partners. Next slide, please. So when we talk about all these aspects, relevance and appropriateness is significant. So we can, in our context here, 3 years back, we witnessed a major educational reform where we saw how the inclusive approach was ingrained within that educational reform, again, to provide inclusion, equity, and respect diversity within our schools. And also with the coming up with of the special education needs authority 3 years back. We, like I already mentioned, a bit for visually impairment learners. And something commendable that happened last year just after the pandemic. So we can dispense the use of distance learning and online learning in case the educational institutions are closed temporarily. So that's a commendable initiative from the Ministry.
Anuradha, can you hear me? We have some issues with the sound. I think we just lost Anuradha. Let's just wait a couple of seconds to see whether she can reconnect.
Yeah. So I think there was a small issue with the connectivity. So moving on to the next slide, please. So when we talk about efficiency and effectiveness, it is important to bear in mind that cost-effective, accessible, affordable, and scalable technologies are equally important, so that we have it is impactful and at the same time it is sustained. So here in our context, we saw that WhatsApp have been commonly used because of its popularity and ease of use in a platform together with adapted learning resources. And we have to acknowledge that learner-friendly technology for SEN education is crucial, together with forging stronger partnership between schools and home. Next slide, please. So when we talk about impact and sustainability, we have to be very careful because the impact it is directly relational to the type and degree of disabilities. So the type of learning disabilities with the type of learners with different degree of disabilities we're working with. So we need to be very careful aligning with those Ordeal solutions, so that will directly impact on the type and degree of disability of learners. And that brings us to the sustainability part. So again and again, collective intelligence and actions are important to build on on pre-existing technologies and experiences. And next, when we move from the policy to implementation phase, we have to be there has to be a very smooth transition, and it has to be monitored very carefully. And also, when we talk about sustainability, we need not to forget about the focused approach for a sustained and inclusive disability education, attributing to inclusive education. Next slide, please. So the key recommendation, if we take it from two levels, from the macro level to the micro level. So at the government level, it was echoed that the global and sector approach has to be there. So coordination across ministries and across different levels and different ministries have to be there. Together with the national ICT policy for SEN education, the ingrained professional capacity building for the SEN learning community.
Anuradha, we have again a sound issue. Can you hear me? We cannot hear you. Anuradha?
Parent training, formal parent training in terms of the ICT skills together with the digital.
Anuradha, can you hear me? Okay, let's see whether she can reconnect. It seems when she reconnects, the sound is better. Okay, we may have lost her. Okay, let's move on. I apologize for the bad sound quality, but I think she was at the end of her presentation. So let me thank Anuradha for this really interesting presentation and insights into the situation in Mauritius during the pandemic as far as technology-enabled learning is concerned. Now we're going to move straight into the presentation for Bangladesh. And I'm very happy to present Bashka Bhattacharjee, a national consultant for accessibility in the Aspire to Innovate program of the government of Bangladesh. He's joining us from Dhaka. Mr. Bhattacharjee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
So thank you very much, Jennifer, for your assistance and support. I'm grateful to you and UNESCO IIP. You just made nothing about us without us. You just made it happen. Thank you. And apology to the audience who are listening me. I will use assistive technology, which may create some extra noise. I'm sorry for any inconvenience. And also, I would like to say thank you to all the contributor, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Welfare, Ministry of ICT Division, and especially my colleagues from A2I who have contributed us a lot to conduct this study. Today, we are going to present a study we have conducted with the support of UNESCO IIP on accessible reading materials initiative of Bangladesh government, how it is contributed during COVID pandemics for the children with disabilities in Bangladesh. It was experienced that Bangladesh government have ratified the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities among the first 20 countries in 2007. And as you know, UNCRPD has given priority to the accessibility, right to information and education. And also, Bangladesh has ratified the Child Rights Convention, and it was evidence that government have a plan to achieve the SDG by 2030. In each of the international commitments, digitalization, accessibility, and inclusion is the highest priority. And based on this international commitment, Bangladesh government has adopted few policies and law. One is the educational policy. The education policy in several sections, it was mentioned about the digital education, e-learning, and inclusive digital education, accessibility, etc. And also the Bangladesh government adopted the Persons with Disability Rights and Protection Act 2013, which is very significant law for promoting rights of persons with disabilities in Bangladesh, which was adopted and in line with UNCRPD. And there is a separate section on accessibility and also accessible information, web, and inclusive education. Another significant policy we observe, that is a national skill development policy. 5% quota was mentioned in the skill development policy. Any types of skill development, 5% persons with disabilities will be included. And children policy and other some Children Act also address about the inclusion of people with disabilities in all sectors. I didn't use any data of persons with disabilities in that study. You will find it in our case study, but we have observed there is a confusing data. One data shows like 1.4% is the rate of persons with disabilities. Another data of Bureau of Statistics, it was mentioned 9.6. And Ministry of Social Welfare, they already make a database of 2 million people with disabilities. So data was a confusion. Another challenge we saw that was almost 90% reading materials was in printed form, and also the digital materials was not supported by Unicode. It was completely in colonial form. That was another biggest challenge for ensuring equal and accessible learning materials for people with disabilities. For mitigate these issues, Bangladesh government have a national ICT policy where Article 3 mentioned about the accessible and assistive technology for persons with disabilities and also it's really give importance on digital learning and digital inclusive learning through this policy. This study primarily we tried to understand how Bangladesh government accessible reading materials has impacted during COVID pandemics, and also how other initiative which was taken by A2I and other agencies, government agencies of Bangladesh government, how this initiative, accessible reading initiative, have contributed. We observed since 2009, Bangladesh transformed into a digital Bangladesh, and everything, all the service, including education, are transforming into digital. And also, we found that Bangladesh government has initiated accessible reading materials in 2014. Especially A2I has initiated this in 2014. Along with some non-government organizations like Young Power in Social Action NGO and other international organizations such as WIPO, Accessible Book Consortium, DAISY Consortium, UNDP, etc. So it was a collaborative initiative, and we understand that during closure of schools, the accessible reading materials initiative integrated for providing accessible and inclusive education for people with disabilities, as they are digitally ready for providing reading materials and education for people with disabilities. How effective and efficient of this initiative, if I see, it was observed there was a serious lack of accessible reading materials in Bangladesh. It was highly dependent on the Braille books. And Braille books also production was very, very difficult because there was no accessible Unicode supported text. And a student received the books, maybe 10 years old Braille books they read in their educational year, which was even syllabus also not really aligned. So that was a big challenge for children with disabilities in Bangladesh. The books, all the textbooks which was created under the accessible reading material was very useful, and all the textbooks grade 1 to grade 2, grade 12 was converted into different accessible formats such as multimedia talking book, that was full text, full audio, accessible ebook, digital Braille, etc. It was observed, like one of the student was telling during our FGD. She told us, like, when a pandemic started and their hostel was closed, and they didn't bring their Braille books, as it is very heavy to carry to their home. So they were highly dependent on the accessible reading materials like accessible multimedia talking books and accessible ebook, etc. Another issues we saw the student who have the devices, like there is many devices was distributed by the non-government organizations, WIPO supported, and also A2I also distributed some. So the student who have the devices and who have the capacity to buy the devices, they really benefited much. But the a student who are really excluded from getting such kinds of devices, or who are a little bit have some poverty, they really there is really create some digital divide among them. The impact we are seeing, we saw a big impact has created by this. Before that, I would like to mention few issues I just forgot. That is, by using this ARM initiative, it was very helpful during COVID-19, as we have all the textbooks in digital version. So when our A2I has planned to convert other initiatives such as online television program, online education, e-learning platform by Muktopad, Facebook, etc. It was very helpful. One teacher was mentioning he got lots of support from the accessible reading materials as all the texts are available, and when he create lecture and online classes, prepared online classes, it was very helpful for him. And so that was really helped us to understand how impact has created during COVID-19. We saw 75% students really passed the exam by using accessible reading materials. And also these children with disabilities was connected in the education as they have the books on their own form like different alternative form. So it was very, very helpful for them to use it during these pandemics. I was talking about the A2I multimodal approach was highly get support from this accessible reading material. So planner, when they are planning these types of educational shifting, so accessible reading is really play a vital role as it was digitally ready and available for all. Even though we have targeted the persons with disabilities, but it was really helpful for many other students also. We saw A2I has some other initiatives such as Sangsad Television, I already mentioned. So this initiative also benefited from accessible reading materials initiative. I would like to give some recommendation from this study. One point, like we can convert into this recommendation into a future plan. Firstly, I already mentioned there is no intensive data of children with disabilities who are studying or what is their status. So we can develop, government can develop a intensive database of persons with disabilities in Bangladesh, which were really important. And also we observed there was no online delivery mechanism. So a online platform need to established by exchanging books for the people with disabilities. Another important point we observe that is copyright law need to be adjusted, need to include copyright exception because it is a big barrier for making accessible books in Bangladesh. And also Marrakesh Treaty need to ratify. We saw that there was some process already started with the facilitation of A2I and Ministry of Cultural Affairs that they are trying to ratify the Marrakesh Treaty. I believe it will carry out soon. Another important issues need to be addressed. That is capacity development. We understand that some capacity development is needed for the student, teachers, and parents on accessible reading materials. Another important recommendation I would like to mention here, that is scale up the current initiatives such as multimedia talking book, accessible book reader, and also accessible ebook. It needs to be scale up as soon as possible because we understand it's have a great impact. I would like to mention one point here that for mitigating the digital divide, this accessible book reader, we observe they have innovated, which was an Android-based device and a very low-cost device, and government has freely distributed among the around 2,000 children with disabilities all over the country. So that was also, even though it was distributed before the pandemic, but it is became very, very accessible. Same time we saw WIPO and ABC has supported to IPSA for distributing at least, I can't remember the figure now, a large number of smartphone was distributed among the children with disabilities in Bangladesh. So that was also helpful. So in the final note, I'd like to thank you to UNESCO IIEP and also one of the very senior most policymaker today joined here, Mr. Anit Chaudhary. I think he will carry out this initiative at the next level, and his presence make me more hopeful. And and also we saw the commitment of Bangladesh government to make the equitable, accessible education for all, including children with disabilities. So I believe it will be replicated and scale up in next level. Thank you. I think I didn't take much time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bashka. Much appreciated. Very interesting to get more details on the ARM initiative of Bangladesh government's A2I initiative. As you had already mentioned, we're delighted now to I would like to hand over to Mr. Anil Chaudhuri. Mr. Chaudhuri is the policy advisor of the A2I program of the ICT division and the cabinet division of the government of Bangladesh, supported by the UNDP. In this capacity, he leads the formation of a whole of society innovation ecosystem in Bangladesh through massive technology deployment, extensive capacity development, integrated policy formulation, whole of government institutional reform, and an innovation fund. Amongst a range of responsibilities, he's a member of the Prime Minister's National Digital Task Force and the Education Minister's National ICT in Education Task Force. Mr. Chaudhuri will respond to the following question as part of this section of our program today. The following question was provided for him before the event. Measuring the impact of technology-enabled distance learning is vital to enhance practice and plan for future initiatives. How can the impact of programs such as the Accessible Reading Materials Initiative that we just learned about best be measured? Mr. Chaudhuri, you have 3 minutes to respond to this question. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you very much for that very kind introduction. As Sergey, Anuradha, and Bhaskar have talked about, so there are many common elements that have come about. All governments have made inclusion a priority. There is no doubt about that. I think the challenge lies, and the discussion that we just heard from Bhaskar, such as the accessible reading materials, even though it was inaugurated by the Honorable Prime Minister, so it was the head of the government and the Education Minister jointly inaugurating it. There are problems that lie, not only in Bangladesh, but in other countries as well, developed and developing. 3 problems that I see. One is the lack of understanding of disability in all its nuances by policymakers. So that there is no one kind of disability. There are multiple types of disabilities and different interventions are needed. So when we talk about ODL, really we need to understand the nuances, and I don't think we do. The second is lack of understanding of the right design for the ODL. We have tried different types of ODL design, and accessible reading material has been one of the most successful ones. And thanks to Bhaskar and many of the colleagues that we have at A2I and other organizations such as IPSHA and a few other NGOs that we work together on, I think we tried to understand the design from the user's perspective, and it's often not done. So design is a very important aspect of designing ODL. And the third is lack of resources. So just financial resources, making this a priority and putting the money where the mouth is for the government, I think often doesn't happen. So I think those are the 3 that I see. You asked me about a particular question about how to measure. So what we have seen in Bangladesh, there are about 1.8 million people who have disability. And we don't have the right disaggregation also. So we may have gender disaggregation, but we don't have disaggregation by different types of disability to the exact level. So Bhaskar talked about developing a database. And development of this database actually requires multiple organizations to work together. So that's a challenge as well. So we have 2 ministries of education, a primary education ministry and a secondary and post-secondary Ministry of Education. And then we have the Ministry of Social Welfare, which looks after disability issues, because social welfare is seen as the arm of the government that looks at special needs. But education for special needs students needs to be done by Education Ministry. So there is that collaboration that often doesn't happen. So collaboration is very important. In terms of measurement, we need disaggregation. We have used, as Bhaskar talked about, TV as our primary mode of education delivery in the last almost 16 months now, since schools were closed in March of 2020 and have not reopened. Really, we have some religious schools that have operated during these 16 months, but by and large, the whole education sector is closed, which basically meant we had to resort to ODL. And TV was the primary means of delivering education, because Internet was only accessible to maybe 20% of the primary school students, and maybe about 35% of the secondary school students. TV was actually available to about maybe 60% of the students. So it had far greater reach. In terms of what else we can do in future is looking at potentially radio and mobile phones. We have a national helpline that we have repurposed for health and many other purposes. And we're now looking at repurposing that for education as well. So students can actually call in to that number and get educational support. So the combination of all these different types of technologies, the right design, and the right type of printed materials also, as the printed and electronic materials, so the accessible reading material that Bhaskar talked about. The combination actually will make a big difference. And as I mentioned, the collaboration across the government with different agencies within the government, but also collaboration with the edutech companies. We have seen a plethora of edutech companies that have emerged during the COVID time period, so that they have mushroomed during COVID. We've also seen a lot of teachers providing lectures on Facebook, and that has also increased in terms of volume and reach during the COVID period. So these kinds of collaboration also needs to be nurtured and further strengthened. As far as maybe metrics are concerned, I think we need to look at rate of participation of learners with disability in the mainstream education and set goals across these metrics. We also need to set metrics around whether we are doing the right design, whether the design of the ODL is being effective or not. So the studies that we have just seen from the 3 countries, I think, give us a glimpse of that, but it has to be on a continuous basis. Effectiveness of the ODL with the right inclusive design. And lastly, what I would like to talk about that many of you have talked about is the infrastructure availability. So cost of internet is an issue. Cost of devices, accessibility of internet and devices is an issue. So again, making sure that the government makes resources available for supporting persons with disabilities, students with disabilities is a major thing that we need to look at. And one thing that we have been discussing in Bangladesh, this is sort of if we can do this, it's in discussion phase right now, but if we can do this, it'll be a breakthrough, is to look at potentially creating a social safety net for persons with disabilities around technology. So we now do cash transfer, we do food transfer for underserved population, and COVID has increased budget towards that. But why can we not look at maybe access to technology, access to internet, access to device as part of the social safety net program? So we are discussing that right now. It is sort of a disruptive idea, and how to put that into implementation, put that into policy. We have not figured that out. Maybe we will get a lot of good ideas from this discussion today. So again, thanks to Jennifer for inviting me, and thanks to UNESCO for making this conference happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chaudhuri, for your very insightful comments on how Bangladesh is moving forward in making the education system more inclusive and taking COVID as a trigger to start thinking about the use of technology in more strategic ways. So that's been very, very interesting. Thank you for that. We have to move on. I would like now, moving from the government level, we're moving to Rwanda. I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Enoch Nibitsi, who is the director of a daycare center for children with intellectual disabilities. So here we are looking at the experience of a director at the micro level. So the question that we've asked Mr. Nibitsi to respond to today is the following. The human dimensions of distance learning are often underestimated. However, they are even more crucial when it comes to learners with disabilities. What role do you see for technology-enabled distance learning solutions for learners with disabilities in the post-conflict era in Rwanda? And how can different stakeholders, including organizations of persons with disabilities, play an active role in supporting this agenda in Rwanda? Mr. Nibitsi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I don't know if you are getting me well. Is the sound good?
I can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Greetings from Kigali. Thank you for this time. I'm going to talk a bit on the role of technology-enabled distance learning, the case of our country. First of all, I'm going to say this as one of the educators who try to keep any contact with the learners with the intellectual challenges all along this pandemic. As you know, the Rwanda was in lockdown, especially the Kigali, the capital city, was in lockdown for almost 1 year. So learners were not able to come to school, but we tried our best to keep in contact through different materials. So one of the advantages or one of the all of this technology-enabled distance learning we have seen is that we, with this digital content, which was as easily manipulated, so we managed to keep in contact. The content was easily accessed by the learners and the parents, of course. For this to happen, we certainly needed the contribution of parents. So we needed parents to assist their children. So these learners with intellectual challenges, they have but always they need especially support when doing anything. So what we are teaching them here mostly is about communication, social inclusion, raising their autonomy or developing their autonomy in the activities of their living. There is sport and physical education, basic ICT and health sciences, and things in that way. So for every single activity that we try to do with them, we needed the parental involvement. So this digital content was easily manipulated. So the parents or any other one who was with a child was able to manipulate the content to the level of a learner. So we expose their content, we expose the materials, and they will able to manipulate the content to their very level. So in a few words, the content was, digital content was easily accessible and manipulated. So the secondary, this technology-enabled distance learning, it gives flexibility to children. When we are bringing them here to school, we expect them to be at the same level. But personally, each and every learner has his or her own problems. So if he's not good in a mood, the parents or any other assistant at home was able to do any activity with the child at his or her own time and his or her own space. When the child is free, when the child is ready to run, which is different from the time when we are bringing them here at the school. So when you are bringing them here at the school, we expect them to run immediately at the same pace, but at the home, they learn in their own space and time when they are free, when they are ready to run. And the other good advantage that we have seen is that the content was the content can be accessed by a big number of learners at a go. So here at the school, we expect that each and every class must have not more than 10 learners at a go. But at home, when the content was published on given the platform that we were using, so we had a great chance of this content to be accessed by a big number of runners at the same time, which is different from when they are here at the school, where we expect a class to have not more than 10 or 8 learners at the same time. So as I said also, we get a chance for the parental involvement. So parents were able to see what their children are learning here at the school and really how they can help them. The only challenge that we have seen is that not all parents are able to understand the special educational need of their children, so which became a problem for some parents in the rural areas. But as the research shows, some parents in the urban areas were able to make a follow-up, to participate in the learning of their children, which is contrary to the children in the rural areas. So, and this helps us to prevent isolation and the stress to our children when at home. So thinking that they are isolated, most of them, they were not even able to understand why they are not coming to school. So my personal experience, I've got one child from his home. He came here to school to see if other learners are coming. But since when we introduced this distance learning, so the children being able to understand that it is a global problem, it is a general problem, not his family or her own family's problem. So this will what we are expecting from this technology-enabled distance learning. So what I see the stakeholders can be doing is, first of all, I'm requesting this UNESCO IIEP so that they can disseminate this report, so that every party concerned must understand the cause and the importance of this distance learning, of using these audio materials. So, and they understand his role in the empowerment and the sustainability of this project, of this agenda. So I'm requesting you to disseminate this report to the concerned parties so that they understand their law and how they can pray better their law for the global interest or for the general interest. Secondly, I'm recommending the government of Rwanda, especially the Rwanda Education Board, that they can devise their curriculum so that they include a component of ICT enabled learning. So regarding on how the curriculum was, we never expected that this could happen. So, but right now we're experiencing this challenge. So if this curriculum be reorganized so that they reserve a point on how ICT can be included in this learning, it will be better. And also it will be a good time for digitalizing the whole content so that learners can access it even at home.
And can you wrap up, please? Yeah, can you wrap up?
I was in a lot of stakeholders, yes?
Okay.
Yes, the point one was that I was suggesting the UNESCO, this Institute of Technology, so that you can disseminate this report so that every concerned party should understand the cause and the importance of this research, and they understand where the party would be praying for the better implementation of this project. Secondly, I was suggesting that the Rwanda Education Board or other concerned party like the Ministry of Education, that they can be digitalizing the content so that the content can be easily accessed by learners when at their home places. Regarding on how the curriculum was, we never expected this to happen, but recently we're experiencing this. So if they make like a revision of this curriculum, they will be reserving a praise on how ICT can be involved when delivering content to learners, and how learners can be learning from their home and the parents also being involved. The other challenge or Lord, that I'm expecting from stakeholders is the provision of audio materials and the adapted, of course. So when dealing with this, we found a big problem that most of the families, especially in remote areas, they had no access to computers, they had no access to internet, and it was a very serious problem. So I'm recommending that these audio materials can be disseminated, can be available to all runners with a prior to those with disabilities. Number 4, I'm suggesting the empowerment of educators. As the research is showing, only few educators had received the training before the pandemic, and the other few of them have received the training during the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic, but not all of them. So we are suggesting the empowerment of teachers and the other educators that are playing a key role in the use of ICT in the use of Ordeal materials, this distance learning. So it will be of a great importance. Lastly, recommending like the Rwanda National Commission for People with Disability that they can conduct awareness campaign for parents with children with disability so that they understand their special educational needs and they understand the ability and the shortcomings of their children. And the problem that we faced during this implementation of open distance learning is that most of the parents were not even able to understand the educational needs of their children. So if this awareness campaign being conducted, so everyone will understand the needs and how this need can be addressed. So I think this is what I had to say on this. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for everyone for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enoch. We really appreciate your detailed recommendations from your perspective of a director of a care center for children with intellectual disabilities. Very, very valuable indeed. Let's move on. I would like to give the floor over to Mrs. Sharmila Sobi, who is the head of specialized schools at the Ministry of Education, Tertiary Education, Science and Technology of the government of Mauritius. The question we had asked her was, a child's education must be well-rounded, encompassing more than just curriculum study. Social, civic, and emotional learning are all important factors. How can technology-enabled distance learning help to facilitate the delivery of a well-rounded education, particularly for students with disabilities? So what are some of the lessons learned that can perhaps be applied to post-COVID planning initiatives? Mrs. Sobi, the floor is yours. If you could keep your intervention to 3 minutes, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So this year, school resumption has been postponed to the 5th of July. In this context, the Ministry of Education has designed a work program for distance and online learning for pupils with disabilities. In collaboration with all stakeholders from the 21st of June to the 2nd of July for the education sector, including educators and the Mauritius Institute of Education. Some of the technological facilities that are being made available to these children are online flipped textbooks, which are available on the MI portal and accessible to all educators with relevant teacher's guide to facilitate the process of delivery to the pupils. Educators and heads of schools are working in straight collaboration with lecturers and senior lecturers from the MIE to provide online teaching and learning tools to facilitate distance learning for learners with disabilities. We are having also video broadcast by the national channel for distance learning, which can be adapted for children with special needs, such as for those with hearing impairment. These programs are being signed by a sign interpreter. Group and individual video conferencing is being highly used, namely Teams and Zoom application. And for those who cannot access these applications, WhatsApp is broadly favored in such a way that educators and learners, which can be accompanied by their parents during the process of the teaching and learning. It is to be noted that during these online programs or video conferencing, all materials are being adapted to the needs of the learners and the degree of disability of the learner. Children with visual impairment are using applications such as text-to-speech and JAWS, whereby the teachers are accompanying the pupils in the process of teaching and learning. Braille notes are also available to pupils. They take the Braille notes at home. Teachers prepare worksheets in Braille and then distribute it to the children, just to counteract the fact that some pupils still don't have access to technology as such. So worksheets and booklets are being prepared for collection and distribution to learners.
Can you wrap up, please, Mrs. Sobi? Can you wrap up? Because we're running out of time. I would very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Just to make a point, some RDCs, special education RDCs, which provide therapy services, that is occupational, speech, and audiology, as well as video, which are not operational at this time. To counter this situation, therapists have developed video programs to be broadcasted on the national channels and or online application to enable parents and or caregivers to practice with children so as to avoid regression. This is the most important part of learning and teaching that has been taking place, is that for these children with severe disabilities, we have devised this year therapy session for online broadcasts and channel broadcasts on the national TV, so as to avoid that regression which was felt last year when pupils with severe disabilities came back to the RDCs. They were very much behind what they have, the progress that was seen during the year. There was a complete regression. So that was the main thing that we did this year, is to have these video programs for therapy specifically. And also for psychological issues, educational psychologists are making use of video conferencing or WhatsApp and even phone conversation to provide support to children and parents in this time of the pandemic, to avoid over emotional disturbance, depression, and things like that, and stress.
Thank you. Are you done, Mrs. Sobi? I apologize for having to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. I know it's running out of time. So I did rush a little bit.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sobi. I appreciate your understanding, because I would like to give the floor to your colleague as well, as I know that she would like to say a few words as well. So let me just briefly introduce her. This is Mrs. Kavita Purmasur. She's Assistant Manager in ICT at the Ministry. So Mrs. Purmasur, if you would like to say a few words, please limit yourself to a maximum 3 minutes. Thank you. Mrs. Purmasur, are you on the Zoom call? Okay, I believe we don't have Mrs. Purmasur with us, which basically leaves me to hand over for our closing session to Mr. Moses Servada. Mr. Servada represents the Uganda Federation of the Hard of Hearing today at our event. So we bring in the voice of the Disability People's Organization. He's a program coordinator at the Federation, responsible for the programming, design, and implementation of activities, events, and fundraisers. Mr. Servada, I'm handing over to you, please, to close our event today. Thank you. Mr. Servada, can you hear me? Okay, let's hold on for a few minutes. There he is. Hello, Mr. Servada. Can you switch on your sound? And please confirm that you can access the captions for your intervention. You are still on mute. If you could unmute yourself.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sarvada. We can see and hear you now. Can you access the captions?
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm share about some of the key lessons that learners with disabilities and their access and use of technology from the perspective of an organization of persons with disabilities. The pandemic has exposed the gaps in the online education platforms. Based on what has been presented in this webinar, I will provide key lessons from the perspective of
Mr. Sarvada, I think we lost connection. We can't hear you. Can you hear us? I believe Mr. Sarvada will try to reconnect from Uganda. Let's hope his connection is stable.
Just having internet. I have an internet problem, but I'm connecting here.
We can hear you now.
I'm presenting about the lessons are structured in 6 groups. The first one is nothing about us without us. The pandemic has pushed the technology and education to the forefront. It has provided some learners with disabilities with a glimpse of how technology can provide access to education in a more flexible and personalized way. On the other hand, evidence is emerging that in many instances, access and use tended to be unplanned and somewhat haphazard, often leading to the exclusion of learners with disabilities in the education. This is the case of persons who have hearing loss, who have psychosocial disabilities, and who are blind, primarily because of lack of attention to their accessibility needs. For example, in Uganda, government adopted use of radios, televisions, newspapers, and online applications like Zoom. But this was never successful in the face of learners with disabilities in terms of accessibility, affordability, and availability. In Rwanda, for example, it was reported that lack of computers or even smartphones are the main barriers for promoting effective distance learning for learners with disabilities because they are not easily affordable. Addressing this requires provision of safe equipment to learners with disabilities by the government in order to increase on their schooling rate. Also, earmarking of specific funds can help in this regard. Good collaboration between ministries of education and ministries of finance can also support this. Another lesson, persons with disabilities need to be part of the discussion on how technology can be beneficial to their access and learning needs. Government and other stakeholders are able to benefit from the enormous guidance of organizations of persons with disabilities on the best possible ways of including learners with disabilities. In Uganda, for example, the initial lack of engagement of organizations of persons with disabilities ensured little attention to the critical needs of learners with disabilities, especially the use of technology to deliver long-distance learning. Therefore, ministry staff are well placed to reach out to these groups and invite them to roundtables or consultations. Another lesson, make learning materials accessible in context of COVID and beyond for all learners. Also, early exposure of learners with disabilities to technology prepare employment. More formative testing can benefit learners with disabilities, particularly when they are out of the classroom. Curriculum must be designed to be inclusive of all learners with disabilities. Consultation with disability groups can support this. Government must come up with accessible audiovisual materials during televised learning. Braille, home-based reading materials are also necessary for blind learners and promotes their engagement while they are at home. Provision of sign language interpreters on television, on televised education program is effective for deaf learners, but overshadows the needs of captioning for the hard of hearing. Therefore, sign language should be promoted hand in hand with captioning. It has been mentioned that countries like Mauritius have been implementing a televised program where captions are, where sign language has been provided. So that one is okay, but captions have always been ignored. So the use of live captioning and use of subtitles during long distance learning also helps to promote effective engagement of hard of hearing learners. Personal computers fitted with the screen reader and screen magnifier software to all students with visual impairment is beneficial. Lesson 3 is having the theme data collection on access and use of technology in education for planning with focus on families and their children. Little is known about the access and use of technology at community level. World technology advances rapidly. We know little about the users and the users of technology in family environments with children with disabilities. That also includes what type of support needs families may have to access technology and learn. This kind of information will be very crucial to develop digital service delivery infrastructure as we come out of the pandemic. The fourth theme is the role of parents and caretakers. Parents and caretakers became the main focal points when the learning process was transferred to the home of students. When technology was presented as a major solution, little was known as to whether they were equipped to deal with it. Lesson: parents and caretakers of learners with disabilities need to be active participants in the technology debate. Consultation should include them as they know their children best. They also need to be included in capacity development initiatives at the community level. Heads of schools are well positioned to reach out to parents and to consult with them, offer their support. Heads of schools themselves can be encouraged to do this at roundtables or ministry-ready training stroke support. Parents and caregivers of learners with disabilities require guidance and distance support to assist in setting up equipment and support the education program for their learners with disabilities. Lesson 5, the theme is teachers' skills. It has been learned that whereas technology is important, most of the teachers have limited knowledge and skills on how existing technology can be meaningfully used and or adapted to address both issues of access and use of technology to learners with disabilities. In Uganda, many teachers in primary, secondary, and higher institutions of learning could not effectively use online platforms like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, among others, to support online education. And the lesson here, capacity development of capacity development or training to use the technology in inclusive ways to ensure all learners are included. Rwanda was reported that they have tried to adapt in this way. Again, heads of school play a key role here in facilitating the capacity building of their teaching staff. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude by saying learners with disabilities should be at the center of policy and practice and not the technology. Their voices need to be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sarvada, for this very powerful closing speech today that has summarized nicely some of the points that the various panelists have made throughout this discussion today. And I also think you bring in a very important voice to the debate. So I thank you for taking the time to make this closing presentation today. I would now also like to thank all our panelists for sharing their thoughts and recommendations that we hope will serve to feed into post-COVID planning efforts in the area of technology-enabled learning for children with disabilities. And of course, I would also like to thank all our participants today for joining this very interesting debate. We will place this presentation on IIEP's YouTube channel. I also wanted to briefly express thanks to our team here today, Sage Capo-Greco and Richard Ingram, and of course, Natalia Amelina again from our partner institute on information technologies in Moscow. So thank you to all, stay safe, and we hope we see you at future events at IIEP. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.